Vic, you've had extensive experience managing pharmaceutical requirements in the US Army, as well as being part of the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm really interested to have you share a bit about your background for today's listeners.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Kelly. Really appreciate it. So I served 27 years on active duty in the United States Army as an Army officer. I had the fortunate uh, opportunity to be not only a healthcare supply chain medical logistician, but I had several years of training and experience developing biologics, specifically biodefense vaccines. And with that dual kind of background, I was able to take assignments that allowed me to understand both the supply chain impacts and aspects of the pharmaceutical product, but also even the regulatory and the development of pharmaceutical products and quality being an important aspect of that.
Now, given your experience and the time frame of the last few years, everybody is acutely aware of what we've been through. Can you talk a little bit about your role in the response to the COVID pandemic and vaccine rollout?
Sure. Back in 2020, I was in a position where about a 25 bed, a 25 hospital organization. I was the head of supply chain for that organization at the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. But what we saw as we got into June and Operation Warp Speed was stood up as a kind of a public-private partnership and really a collaborative between the Defense Department and Health and Human Services. Because I had a background in developing biodefense vaccines and then really working very quickly to accelerate an Ebola vaccine in 2014 to 2016, I was invited in by General Perna to be the vaccine program manager of one of the leading vaccines in the portfolio, and that was the Moderna vaccine. And so I was detailed for a year, right from uniform active duty right into BARDA and HHS and the whole team there for 1 year, starting in June of 2020.
Now, you've also had the opportunity to advocate and speak publicly on some of the things that you've seen and learned over the course of your career. Most notably, and very recently, you had the opportunity to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services, specifically to the Subcommittee on Personnel. Now, the focus of that testimony is actually something we're going to talk about today. So can you talk a little bit about the intent of that hearing and specifically the information you were there to offer?
Sure. So that Senate testimony was on 30 April of 2024, so just about 2.5 weeks ago, and it was really about hearing from both a government panel and an industry panel made of academics and industry representatives about the Defense Department's access to safe and high quality pharmaceuticals within the supply chain, and the overarching concern that our supply chain was becoming too reliant on overseas foreign sources of supply. Really, the origins of that hearing go back about even 3 or 4 years ago, when a bipartisan group of senators had sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense back in 2019 sharing this concern. With the pandemic hitting in 2020, a lot of that got delayed for a couple years. And so this topic of our over-reliance on a pharmaceutical supply chain, mostly from overseas sources, notably China, became more of a topic in this past year. And as a result, the Senate wanted to hear an update on where we're at with that concern.
Now, given a lot of the different types of supply chain shortages we've dealt with over the last few years, this sort of general idea, I think, will be very familiar to anybody listening in today. But when you start talking about anything pharmaceutical or healthcare related, it instantly gets personal. So, what are some examples of the types of drugs that we've seen be more likely than others to be affected by these supply chain shortages?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think some of the shortages, the drugs that you're typically going to see that are going in shortage are those low margin generic pharmaceuticals, typically that a lot of the US companies and Western companies over the last several years could not financially find a reason to produce due to a variety of things that were happening in the marketplace. So number one, there was a lot of consolidation in the marketplace, and that is in this particular instance, some foreign countries like China had plans that go back many years to subsidize some of their pharmaceutical industries so that they could actually get more market share for some of these medicines.
Mm.
And as a result, there was, some of these drugs were targeted for a number of years so that it would compel a lot of US or Western companies to either give up making these drugs so that they could be made overseas. When we saw that consolidation over the number of years, we saw that lead to problems in the supply chain for quality because, one, part of the strategy was to lower the cost of goods sold to the point where you may not invest to the level you need to in quality manufacturing. On top of that, you had this other challenge where the regulatory agencies, such as the FDA, had a very difficult time doing inspections of these plants just due to the geographic distance, but also the fact that they had to give many, many weeks notice for inspection of these plants, where that's not really the case in the United States, where they can march in same day or the next day. And those challenges or those opportunities for those manufacturers overseas allowed them to gain more market share because they were able to lower their costs so much that the marketplace adapted to that, and they were rewarded for selling really cheap medicines. And as a result of the inability of the regulatory agency to inspect on a regular basis, let's say every 2 years, like they do at a US company, you started seeing gaps of 3, 5, even more than that, years between inspections. So when the FDA, after the coronavirus pandemic, was able to open up more inspections, they started to find a lot more problems in places like in India or in China. And as a result of those problems, a lot of these facilities ended up having to shut down to remediate those problems. And when you had a market that was so consolidated down to maybe 2 companies or 3 companies that make the world supply of a key antibiotic, you're going to have major shortages derive out of that.
And yet it's difficult because, again, we're balancing sort of our professional understanding of the supply chain with our personal desire to make sure that medicines are affordable and accessible. But when all of these dynamics come together, unfortunately, we do end up with a situation that seems to be where we are today, where we have a troubling level of reliance on foreign entities in our pharmaceutical supply chain. So you've mentioned now China, you've mentioned India. And in fact, in going back through your testimony in preparation for speaking with you today, a couple of statistics, particularly about China, really jumped out at me. One of them is that the source of 20% of vital medicine APIs, now those are active ingredients for anybody listening in that's not in pharmaceuticals. So if you pick up a container of over-the-counter and it says the active ingredient is on the back, 20% of the APIs for vital medicines come from China, and 45% of the key source materials are sole sourced from China. Those seem like troubling statistics to me, but as someone inside of pharmaceutical and healthcare and certainly military preparedness, what high-level concerns do these statistics and the trends that they indicate raise for you?
Right. I would even say it's even worse than that, in that those 20 or so percent that of APIs that are of those vital medicines, about 60 vital medicines in the United States that some organizations have labeled, are solely sourced from China. That means there's not even a secondary source of supply in the world. And so not only for the key starting materials and the API is that a very large risk, what it does is it puts the United States in a situation where there's a lot of overwhelming leverage over us for such an important commodity, right? This means that if there was a geopolitical event or tensions in the South China Sea over Taiwan policy, etc., and they wanted to use withholding or an embargo of key materials or these key active pharmaceutical ingredients, that directly impacts U.S. healthcare for some of the most critical medicines that Americans rely on. And on top of it, we don't have another source, right? So it's already a very risky proposition to put all your eggs in like one company in one country, regardless of whether or not it's even China. Any single source for a critical medicine for life-saving or life sustainment or chronic condition is a high risk that um, I think people need to really be aware of.
Well, it's certainly something that private sector procurement and supply chain professionals understand. I mean, we've seen, I think it was as short as 18 months or 2 years ago, how many Ford trucks were sitting and waiting because they simply couldn't get the blue oval that goes on the front grille because it was a sole sourced part. So we understand the challenges that you're going to be faced with when anything is sole sourced. And that doesn't even extend into the territory of sole sourcing from China, where we do know there are concerns. I mean, you mentioned Taiwan, and certainly everybody will be familiar with the Chips and Science Act. We've committed excess of $50 billion funds to private industry to make us less reliant on semiconductor chips made in Taiwan. And yet we have a very similar dynamic going on in the pharmaceutical industry. It certainly seems like this is something that the entire general public, well beyond the government, healthcare industry, and even military, should be focused on.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're starting to see a little bit more reporting of this in various news outlets. Even mainstream news outlets are now catching on to this. It's certainly within the industry a concern. Obviously, within Congress on both sides of the aisle, it's a big concern. And I think really the big thing that when Americans start to better understand what's going on here, they can all recognize, and it goes back to something you said a couple of minutes ago, this is something that directly affects every one of us. Because even if you're not on a prescription med today, the likelihood of you being on one at some point in the next couple of years is high. But I guarantee you know other people in your life, your family members, your dear friends that are reliant on these critical medicines. And when you understand the vulnerabilities in our supply chain, you start to realize how quickly we are dependent on this. And secondly, you start to realize how important the quality of those medicines are to very serious conditions.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because as we try to move from setting up the problem to outlining what potential solutions are, we actually very quickly run into additional problems. You know, back when supply chains were being disrupted, everyone's instinctive response was, that's it. We're going to start manufacturing everything in the United States. And when we realized we couldn't do that quickly enough, we'd say, okay, we're going to near shore it. We're going to friend shore it. We're going to do China plus one. But the real complexities associated with all of those alternatives make it not as simple as we would like it to be. And yet I think people would be surprised to learn, I know I was in researching, that we're actually underutilizing existing US capacity for producing generic drugs. Now, why is it that we have this available capacity in the US and we're not making use of it, given the impact of these shortages?
Right. And that is a problem. And it's simply a market problem. And when you understand that this is a market problem that has taken over 2 decades to develop, you can't unroll it, or you can't fix it overnight. Right. This took 20 plus years to do. Right. Really, the early signs of the market, I would say the first major transition or milestone was in 1984. And that was which the Hatch-Waxman law was passed to provide a faster, more efficient pathway for generic medicines to be approved through an abbreviated new drug application. But you also saw in the 80s, all the industries migrate to a global supply chain manufacturing economy. So there was this big push to make products cheaper and more efficiently overseas, so that you can continue to make profit. And as a result, you saw a lot of problems that arose from that over the number of years. But as we got into the 2000s, the really big next kind of milestone was in 2001, where China was voted in by the United States and other nations as a most favored nation trading partner. And as a result of that, their economy grew, and they were emboldened to actually create strategies across multiple industries to dominate. And as a result, it really capitalized on our culture to like cheap things, right? We went from an economy where you could go into a mom and pop hardware store and buy a tool that was of high quality that would last your family 50 to 100 years, to going into a large store and buying something that you would buy for 5x cheaper, but it might only last you 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
So our culture was really an easy prey on this mindset of making things cheap and disposable and not really lasting and of high quality. And in the pharmaceuticals, you can only do that for so long, and it's going to start to affect patients. It's going to start affect the dynamics of resiliency in that supply chain and the ability to consistently control manufacturing.
Now, during your Senate testimony, Senator Rick Scott asked you what the primary obstacle was to move pharmaceutical supply chains away from China. Do you mind sharing again here what you told him then?
Sure, I'll bound that within the context of federal contracting, because this is really where it kind of is really focused in that line of questioning, and that is a legal loophole called the citrus loophole. And what happened was in 2019, there was a large federal agency, the VA, that tried to live up to the spirit of an executive order from the previous administration that said, "Hey, buy American-made pharmaceuticals," and that meant at that point a pharmaceutical that the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, was made in the United States. Well, what happened was they got taken to court because the industry had evolved itself to the point where some of these foreign companies set up subsidiaries in the United States, and there was already a ban on not buying a final dosage product or pharmaceutical from a Trade Agreement Act non-compliant country. So the idea was, if you wanted to sell to the VA, the Defense Department, Health and Human Services, a final product, that final product could not be manufactured in a TAA non-compliant country. So just like any other kind of market enterprise, they found loopholes around this. And what they ended up doing was they established subsidiaries in the United States where they would still make all the API, all the other ingredients like the excipients that go into the bindings, the fillers, and the colorings of those medicines. They still made them overseas, for example, in a Chinese plant. They shipped all those things over in large barrels to a subsidiary in the United States where they just did the final step of the compounding and the mixing and then the packaging and labeling of that medicine. And then they said, "Oh, it's made in America." And that loophole was created because when this was taken to a federal court in February of 2020, a judge ruled that they could do this. And it completely changed decades and years of how we define what was, country of origin, made in the United States for a medicine. And I think the real big message I was trying to relay to Senator Scott was, you can't do any of this, purchasing or preference for an American-made medicine until you address this legal loophole from a legislative standpoint. Because if you don't do that, then they're going to find ways to basically circumvent what you're trying to do. And that was my message to him.
Well, and it is interesting because what we're talking about is finding a legal definition for made in the USA. So even our simple solution of saying, let's not be dependent on China, let's not be dependent on India, that still has to be defined in some way, but does mixed in the USA count as the same thing as made in the USA? And you mentioned that appeals court ruling came down in February of 2020. I think it's worth just pausing for a minute. I know I'm curious. This is sort of opinion based. We will never know. February of 2020, we were all just perched on the edge of basically the world shutting down.
Correct.
And timing is everything. If that ruling needed to be made, even 30 or 60 days, but certainly 180 days later, do you think there would have been different factors involved in the decision, if not potentially a different outcome?
I think that's possible and likely because of what we learned of our vulnerabilities during COVID, right? And so that the timing of that case is really key here, in that the only way I think a primary way where that got approved was because it was right before the coronavirus pandemic lockdowns. I think if that case would have gone into even a month or 2 months later, there would have been a lot more awareness of how this type of a ruling impacts our ability to produce our own medicines, United States, and not be reliant on other foreign countries to kind of circumvent our trade policies, if you will. So I do think that made a big difference. And I think it also created a situation where we're not addressing this till 2 or 3 years later, right?
Yeah.
And this wasn't something that could have easily gone into an appeal or didn't have an opportunity for Congress to bring this up until in the past year. So I think that's the other cooling effect with the timing is it was just the worst timing for that ruling to come down.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about the fact that because it took decades for this problem to be created, there aren't going to be fast, simple solutions. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any solutions. And in fact, one of the things that you've recommended based on your experience is building a stockpile of some of the active ingredients and KSMs that are included in these pharmaceuticals. So I'm curious why you're advocating for stockpiling sort of the components or ingredients versus stockpiling the finished products. What's the thought process behind that?
Yeah, and what I would like to also do is clarify that the stockpiling is within the context of kind of three other areas. So it's one of four major options in a decision analysis of how do you mitigate this risk. And so one would be, do you make more of these medicines in the United States or with allied partners? Do you just outright buy more of them and continue to buy some of them because it maybe doesn't make sense to make or make them here? The other one is invest. You invest in capabilities and infrastructure to be able to make some of these things where some of that infrastructure doesn't exist anymore. And then the fourth component is stockpiling. And I think the stockpiling of the API and the key starting materials is a unique one in that when you store those materials, they're more likely to have a longer period before expiry. These are typically chemicals or products that are not finally compounded. And so, after, interviewing some experts that are actually making these products, you might be able to store these key starting materials and API for 3 or 4 times the amount of time that you would purchase and buy a finished dosage product. So if you bought a finished pill or some type of sterile injectable that was in final form, you might only have 2 or 3 years to use it up before it just expires on the shelf. And so the idea behind key starting materials and API is you get the potentially 5 to 10, 12 years of expiry. But the other benefit of stockpiling it's another risk mitigation tool that's very similar to what we have for our energy policy, which is why we have a strategic petroleum reserve. We've deemed that, crude oil and to have millions and millions of barrels in it. And last I checked in December of 23, we had over 700 days in the strategic petroleum reserve. That basically sends a message to anybody in the world that if there was an embargo or there was some other geopolitical issue, that based on demands, we have 2 years worth of crude oil. That gives our country a lot more independence for energy policy and geopolitical issues. We can do the same thing for pharmaceuticals by storing and stockpiling key starting materials and API that we are solely reliant on adversarial nations for. And it sends a very powerful message about independence, that if those were to be embargoed or shut off from importing, then we could just pivot those into our supply chain without disruption for potentially 2 years if we stored 2 years worth.
Now, to put this a little bit into context, we talked briefly earlier about chips and science, the investment that's being made there. Obviously, the ingredients would have to be purchased. They would have to be stored someplace, certainly to maximize shelf life, as you talked about. What does the investment look like associated with that type of a strategy? And how does it compare to some of these other categories like semiconductors, like petroleum, where we've deemed these incredibly important materials that for the sake of really national security, we need to be able to take care of ourselves?
Right. Well, the first good news is that the facility's already been built. So with CARES Act money and during the pandemic, the federal government through BARDA built a facility in the United States that's tornado rated. I mean, it's a secure facility and it's already been funded and it's been built and it's in operation. The other benefit is that because these materials, these key starting materials and API are relatively cheap in comparison to making the final dosage product, for a mere tens of millions of dollars, you can pretty much mitigate an extreme risk of over reliance on these pharmaceutical precursors and key ingredients from our number one adversary. So, on the order of tens of millions of dollars, you could stockpile years potentially worth of these critical essential medicines. And you don't have to do it for thousands of medicines. You can
Yeah.
just identify the top 50 or most 60 vital medicines in the United States and focus on that.
Now, one of the other strategies, let's call it, that you recommended that I appreciated is that you called attention to the fact that if we only make these decisions based on price, the US will never be back in a position to be a source of some of these materials and ingredients. Whereas if we expand the decision-making framework to include quality, you talked earlier about FDA inspections of different types of sites. How can we change this entire situation simply by looking at cost as well as quality instead of just cost?
Yeah, I think this is a really big issue that really the industry and people are now just starting to understand and to recognize. And it's really been something that I think has been a big part of what I've been trying to help people understand for the past year and a half. Is we have created a situation where our small molecule generic pharmaceuticals are being treated as a commodity like paper clips
Mm.
from Staples, where you're not going to pay a penny more for a paper clip that you get from Staples from paper clips you're going to buy from Office Max. The difference is these are exquisite medicines that are designed to help people either fight off cancer, to deal with a deadly chronic disease like heart disease, or somebody that's got diabetes and has to have their medicine dialed in just right before they have complications. And so I think this is the problem, is that we've treated this like a simple, low-level commodity when these are essential to life. And I think part of the problem is that, and I'll be very clear here, and I have no problem saying this publicly. I think part of the problem is going back to the regulatory agency, who even on their website today will continue to say that all generic medicines are of the same high quality as the brand name medicines. And what we know in independent third-party testing is that that is just flat out not true. Scientifically, chemically, that's just not true. What I would concede and say is that there are a number of high-quality generic medicines that are made almost to the same degree as the brand name drug. The problem is everybody is blind to that data unless they see the testing data. And so when we start to basically treat all the medicines the exact same way, when we know they have different dissolution curves, they have different levels of API dosage and purity, some of them have concentrations or contaminants in them that are not acceptable based on USP and FDA standards. When we start to see that more transparent data, it will then behave like a normal market where that becomes more transparent, where then people can make actually sourcing solutions, buying quality at an affordable price. And those companies that typically make high quality generic medicines will be rewarded. And those supply chains that are typically more resilient will be able to expand and to do better in the marketplace.
And I think with that transparency, it allows a very important person in this equation, the individual consumer or patient, to start making better decisions. I mean, I will say, for all of the difficulty and challenges of the pandemic, one of the things that I have heard repeatedly from healthcare professionals and supply chain healthcare professionals is that the average patient or consumer is so much more educated now about their own health and about their own healthcare choices than they were, say, 4 years ago. And so if we make some of this information that you're talking about available to the consumer, they can factor it into their decision-making process, and even, if need be, advocate with insurance companies. I mean, it's a complex system, but the first step is getting that information out there. When we think about the cost impact of potentially starting to emphasize quality more, Can you give me a general sense of what the typical differential or increase might be to start placing more of an emphasis on quality?
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about acquisition costs, when you factor in things like testing, what we're looking at is probably no more than 1 or 2% more. And so we have examples where I've seen in the DoD study where you can look at a bottle of medicine, so 100 tablets of medicine X, and the brand name drug might be $55. The typical generic on the low end might be $10.12, and you'll have another generic that might be $11.50 and another one that's $12. However, when we do the testing, what we see is that for the most part, the medicine that's about $11.50 to $12, a dollar or two more for a bottle of 100, is testing at the same level as the brand name drug.
Mm,
So we're talking super high quality of a drug that would normally at brand name would be $55 a bottle. Um, to spend another dollar or two on a bottle of 100, you can get basically the same quality of that brand name drug for the price of a generic. The problem is right now is that typically the drug that'll get the most sales in the current marketplace is that drug that's selling for $10.50. That will win the day in sales and get market share regardless of the quality. Now, once in a while, we'll get lucky and we'll see the testing, and then that'll be a green tested drug.
yeah.
But that's not always the case. And so the problem is if you have a marketplace that's always defaulting towards the cheapest without any factor of quality for quality product, then we're going to get this problem exacerbated even more. And those companies will be rewarded to go on low costs. And it's just a race to the bottom because you're just lowering your cost of goods sold by sacrificing quality. Because that's the one way you could do it. Sourcing cheaper materials, having less of a quality program within your company for testing and auditing. All those things that can drive the quality down just go with that market dynamic.
Now, we've talked today about the fact that you're looking at this, at least in part from your background as being part of the military. And how the military spends its money is different than how companies and individual consumers spend their money. And there's an enormous amount of demand associated with military medical requirements. I was reading a little bit about the Berry Amendment, which requires that DoD and Homeland Security purchases be, and I believe the quote is, manufactured and wholly produced within the United States. When we think about these challenges and the solutions to them at the market level, I'm interested in your point of view about whether the volume associated with military purchases, Homeland Security purchases, add them in there as well, are enough to sort of spur demand and activity so that we can start making use of some of that currently waylaid capacity in the United States for producing generics. Is that the kind of dynamic that could actually spur spending, increase quality, and sort of build a market around military demand that individual consumers and patients would benefit from?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to pilot these things for the nation because you have a captive audience where the Congress has a little bit more control in legislation to, let's say, require the Defense Department, require the VA, which is the largest healthcare system in the United States, by
Mm.
the way, and then parts of HHS. So it's a great place to test some of these ideas within a controlled environment within decently large healthcare systems. I mean, the Defense Department has 10 million beneficiaries. The VA has even more than that. So these aren't insignificant, but they're also not representative of the entire, marketplace.
Yeah.
Really, where you get the benefit of this is if there's legislation that also now includes CMS. So now we start to get into Medicare and Medicaid policy where let's say the Medicare Part B pharmaceutical benefit is tied to some metric of quality, and
Um,
that perhaps you get a better reimbursement, or those drugs are going to be more preferred for reimbursement that are of high quality. Then that's an entire game changer because then that's the super majority of the market for pharmaceuticals for those people over 65. So I think that The federal side is great for pioneering these pilot studies to get data to see, can this work within a large health system? And secondly, what we're seeing right now is other health systems are wanting to join in on this. And if you've ever seen any of these product adoption curves, you can get to a point where about you hit 16 to 18% adoption of any new technology or process, you can start to create irreversible momentum.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're starting to see here with the DoD, with Kaiser Permanente, and some other organizations that have chosen not to go public. But when they do, it's going to have more reverberating effect within the marketplace. And you're going to see more and more health systems and large pharmacies go this route to make quality more transparent within the pharmaceuticals. And you're going to start seeing a lot more trust with the pharmaceuticals that patients are getting, because they feel like there's another third party evaluating the things that they're putting in their mouths every day or in their loved ones every day.
Now, Vic, I appreciate the fact that you've really taken an unbelievably complex issue with a lot of associated challenges and sort of boiled it down to a digestible overview for us today. I tend to like to end these conversations with sort of a key takeaway, but I'm going to make this more complicated for you than it typically is for my guests. I'm actually going to ask you for two. Can I ask you if there was something you wanted people to take away on this topic, on this story, from a supply chain professional perspective, given the global dynamics and national security factors that are involved in that, but a second key takeaway for each of us to think about as patients, humans, family members, advocates for our own health. Can I ask you to give me sort of a final takeaway from each of those perspectives?
Yeah, I think the first thing is if you're really concerned about having access to safe and high quality pharmaceuticals from a supply chain standpoint, I'd encourage your listeners to really understand where this particular market has gone in the last 20 plus years, to understand that it is a very complex and over reliant on a foreign supply chain, and mostly with China, and also to a large extent with India. And once we realize that both of those are non-trade agreement act countries, there's a reason for that, right? And China doesn't even have an independent judiciary. So the companies that work there, even if their government told them to do something that they didn't want to do, they don't have any recourse in an independent judiciary. They have to concede and they have to consent. So people have to understand from a larger supply chain and trade policy what you're getting into when you do business with some of those countries. So I think that's number one. Number two, from a patient standpoint, what I'd ask people to think about is everybody's got somebody they know that is probably an older person. It might be a frail elderly family member. They might have high blood pressure. They might have, congestive heart failure. They're suffering from certain things. And you know that during that journey that they've probably been on multiple medicines that by no choice of their own were told to switch medicines due to a formulary change or something like that. And you realize you've seen them either hospitalized, you've seen them have complications. And what I'd ask you to do is think about, do you want the highest quality possible medicines for those family members? Yes or no? Simple as that. Would you like to see more transparent data on the quality attributes of those medicines so that you can have a better idea in a conversation with your pharmacist and your doctor about why you might be having complications with a medicine that when you were on a different one a couple of months ago, you were having no issues? These are things that are not simple, but these are things that have not been transparent to the American public. And so I'm working with the team to make that as transparent as possible. There's a good number of organizations out there like Kaiser Permanente and the Defense Department's health system that believe that delivering quality care means that they have to deliver the highest quality medicines for their patients. And if we're truly going to be honest about this affecting patients the most, then we should be very curious about the quality of the medicines that we're procuring at scale.
Absolutely. Now, Vic, I appreciate having access to your insight, your experience. If people are encountering this topic or meeting you for the first time by listening to this conversation, where would you recommend that they go either to connect with you or to learn more?
Certainly, I have a presence on LinkedIn, so you can just look under Victor Suarez. I'm a retired colonel. You can find me pretty easily on LinkedIn. If you want to find out more information regarding this from a news standpoint, one area is you can go to Bloomberg. They have a whole series that they've had for a couple years called Bad Medicine. And it has all the articles that go back about this topic that Bloomberg's covered for the last couple years. And then there's two books that I'd recommend for people to read. The first one was a New York Times bestseller that came out, I believe, in 2019 by Catherine Ebon. She's a writer for Vanity Fair. She wrote a book called Bottle of Lies. It was a New York Times bestseller and exposed probably the biggest, largest pharmaceutical scandal for a company in India that happened in the early 2000s. And then another book from a dear friend of mine named Rosemary Gibson, and she's the author of a book called China RX. And that book goes really in depth on all the things that the Chinese government has done over the last 20, 30 years to really dominate in this market space, and some of the risks and concerns and quality deficiencies that we've seen over the last couple decades for products coming out of that country.
Excellent recommendations. Vic, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure being on this podcast with you, Kelly, and I'm happy to do it.